She didn't wear it to make a point. Just black PT shorts, a faded army shirt, and a canvas duffel slung over one shoulder. No rank, no ribbons, no need to be noticed. But the admin officer looked at her once and said, "You can't wear that, not unless you're on active duty." He didn't ask why she was there, didn't check the papers she handed over. He just pointed to a plastic-wrapped navy t-shirt behind the counter and told her to change or leave the base. So she nodded, said nothing, reached for her bag. And when she turned to go, the back of her shirt lifted just enough for someone across the room to catch a glimpse of the ink stretched between her shoulder blades. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't decorative. And it sure as hell didn't come from a beach tattoo shop or a late-night dare. That mark had come from something real, something buried, something that never made the news, but changed the life of someone who still held command. Want to know what that tattoo meant? Why everything changed after it was seen? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The New Mexico sun had barely crested the horizon when Kiona Ridge guided her old Jeep Wrangler through the front gates of Kyburn Gap. Dust kicked up behind the tires in soft ribbons. The wind carried the dry scent of diesel, hot metal, and sand. The kind of air that reminded soldiers of early mornings, long marches, and engines that never quite cooled. She parked without hesitation, engine ticking softly as it cooled. From the outside, Kyburn Gap looked like every other training post: concrete walls, chain-link fences, motor pool lots, and the low hum of generators trying to keep up with the sun. Kiona stepped out quietly. Her movements had the rhythm of someone who didn't rush, who hadn't rushed in years. She was 45 now. Her dark hair pulled back, streaked with silver near the ears. The PT shirt she wore was grayed out from 100 wash cycles, the collar stretched, the hem uneven. The black shorts had lost their crispness. Her dog tags hung tucked behind the neckline, still there after all this time. 23 years, never once taken off. In one hand, folded paperwork from a sergeant major who'd asked for her by name. In the other, a duffel bag she'd carried through 6 countries and 2 continents. Inside the admin building, cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air conditioning pushed against her sun-warmed skin like a wall. Behind the counter sat a young soldier, no older than 20. He blinked up from his computer as she approached. "Volunteer support," she said, offering the papers. "Scheduled for PT pacing." He looked down at the forms, then back at her shirt, and frowned slightly. Before he could speak, a door opened behind him. Lieutenant Warren Bale entered the lobby like he owned the walls. Pressed uniform, high and tight haircut, boots polished to a mirror. He glanced at the paperwork, then at Kiona's shirt. "That shirt's unauthorized," he said. "Unless you're on orders, you can't wear it on this installation." She didn't blink. Didn't explain where that shirt had been. Didn't list the names she'd buried in it. He extended the navy tee. "Change into this or you'll have to leave." Still silent, Kiona bent to retrieve her bag. And as she did, the hem of her shirt lifted slightly, revealing 3 faded numbers. 3, 7, 0. Below them, a hawk in full spread, wings sharp, perched above a broken timepiece. Across the lobby, someone dropped a clipboard. The clipboard hit the linoleum with a flat slap that echoed louder than it should have. Deputy Emmett Rourke didn't even flinch as it bounced once and settled near his boots. His eyes were locked across the room, staring, not at the woman standing quietly at the counter, but at the exposed patch of ink, just visible beneath the hem of her lifted shirt. He'd seen that tattoo before. Not in person, not on skin, but in a windowless room in Tampa, 12 years ago, where low-level analysts with interim clearance were handed redacted reports on events that never made it past internal classification. He had been a junior intelligence officer at CENTCOM then, still green, still idealistic, still thinking that every mission had a full debrief and every hero got their name on a wall. That was before he opened the file on Unit 37, codenamed the Mesquite Watch. The reports were fragmented, buried under layers of blackout ink and compartmentalized access tags. There had been no after-action photos, No medal citations, no body counts. Only a timeline, scribbled in dry, bureaucratic language, that described an ambush in Dusk Valley during the final NATO withdrawal phase. A fallback route compromised. A full enemy battalion pressing the southern corridor. Air support delayed. Ground command fractured. One unit. Watch 37 volunteered to hold the gap. 6 members. One radio. No backup. They bought 41 minutes of resistance, just long enough for the last convoy to pass through the pass. Then silence. Officially, they were listed as MIA, later changed to presumed lost due to structural collapse. But Rourke remembered the footnote at the bottom of the intel summary. Tattoo markers identified in surviving personnel reports. Symbol, Desert Hawk with timepiece. Confirmed use for internal recognition only. Not authorized for public display or ceremonial inclusion. In other words, they weren't just forgotten. They were erased. And now, he had just walked past a woman wearing that very mark on her skin. Rourke bent slowly, retrieved his clipboard, and without a word, turned on his heel and walked toward the back offices. He passed the break room, ignored the idle chatter, pushed through a door marked authorized personnel only, and locked it behind him. The lights inside buzzed to life overhead, casting a sterile glow over filing cabinets and an old comms desk that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. He set the clipboard down, sat, and opened a locked drawer. Inside was a battered black Rolodex. He flipped to the red tab marked Escalation, Tier 3. There it was, a number written in pencil, not printed, not digital. A number he'd been told never to dial, unless the situation involved unregistered return of previously blacked-out assets. He picked up the phone. It was a secure line, rarely used. It rang twice before a voice answered calm. Male, with no identification. Command liaison. Rourke took a breath, suddenly aware of how dry his throat had gone. This is Deputy Emmett Rourke at Kyburn Gap. I need to file a verbal contact report involving possible classified personnel identification. There was silence on the other end, not hesitation evaluation. Rourke could hear the faint tap of keys in the background. Someone was already listening. Probably multiple people. Probably higher than anyone on this base could imagine. Go ahead, Deputy. This line is secure. She's here as a volunteer, he said. Voice even. Female, early to mid-40s. PT uniform, no visible ID. But she's got the 370 mark on her back. And the Desert Hawk insignia. The pause that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy. Are you certain of the identification? Positive, Rourke said, without hesitation. I've seen it in restricted materials. This isn't some amateur or stolen valor case. This is Watch 37, the real thing. Another pause. Then 4 words. Identify her. Confirm. Protect. And tell command. The line went dead. Rourke set the phone down gently, exhaled, and leaned back in the chair. Outside that door, a room full of people still thought this was just another Monday. They had no idea they were standing next to a ghost who wasn't supposed to exist and never should have had to return. Lieutenant Warren Bale still believed he was doing the right thing. He stood behind the intake counter with a confidence that came from memorizing regulations, not living through the reasons they were written. His clipboard was squared off, his voice clipped and polite. His uniform new, starched, and tailored told the world that he took rules seriously, maybe a little too seriously. Across from him, Kiana Ridge stood silent, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breath even. She hadn't challenged his tone, hadn't demanded recognition. She just waited, still as stone, as he explained once again that her shirt was unauthorized, her presence unverified, and her participation conditional. He gestured to the folded shirt in the plastic baga, standard navy blue crewneck, with Kyburn Gap Training Division, printed in bold white letters across the chest. Civilian. Safe. Non-threatening. Appropriately dull. "This is for all off-duty or volunteer personnel," he said. "We need consistency across the formation. We have visiting dignitaries next week. We can't have confusion out on the track." He paused, waiting for a response. She gave none. "I don't make the policies," he added, softening his voice like it was supposed to help. "But I'm responsible for enforcing them." Still, she said nothing. In his mind, Bale was maintaining order, upholding standards, setting the tone. He didn't see a former combat asset standing in front of him. He saw a woman in an old shirt with no visible clearance and no rank patch, and in the narrow corridors of his inexperience, that was enough. So when she picked up the civilian tea and turned to walk toward the exit, he simply checked a box on his sheet and returned to the next folder in his stack. To him, the situation had been handled properly, discreetly, efficiently by the book. But in a locked office down the hallway, Emmett Rourke was already moving. He didn't stop to explain. He left the door open behind him, crossed the corridor with long strides, and picked up the first phone outside of restricted comms. His hand hovered for half a beat before dialing. No one saw him punch in the direct line to Major Elijah McGraw, senior advisor for field operations, and the kind of man who could tell the difference between a dress code and a disaster. McGraw picked up on the second ring. "This is McGraw." "Sir, this is Deputy Rourke, Kyburn Gap. I have a situation involving a female volunteer, early 40s, faded PT shirt, black shorts, no insignia, but she's marked." "Marked. Unit 3, 7-0. Desert Hawk, timepiece." Silence. Then, "You're sure?" "Certain." McGraw didn't hesitate. "Tell Boone. Don't let her leave. I'm en route." That was it. 3 sentences. The rest was momentum. By the time Rourke hung up the phone, the chain of command had shifted behind the scenes. He moved fast, his pulse quick but steady, and stepped back into the hallway just in time to see Kyona reach for the main door with the civilian shirt still folded in one hand. He didn't call out. Didn't stop her. He simply turned left instead of right and walked straight to the commander's wing-passing uniformed staff who still had no idea what had just walked into their building. Inside the lobby, Bale had returned to his paperwork, his jaw set with the mild satisfaction of someone who believed a potential disruption had been neatly avoided. As far as he was concerned, things were orderly again. He didn't see Rourke cross the quad. He didn't see the messages that were already hitting inboxes marked priority in red text. And he sure as hell didn't know that the next person walking through that door wasn't a volunteer looking for permission. It was Sheriff Silas Boone. He wasn't coming to ask questions. Sheriff Silas Boone didn't waste time with ceremony. He was the kind of commander who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. His uniform was regulation, yes, but it bore the wear of years, not starch from the quartermaster. The creases were where they needed to be, but the boots were scuffed from use, not polished for inspection. The silver in his hair came in straight streaks above his temples. The years had set into his shoulders, but not dulled his spine. When Major McGraw's call came in, Boone didn't ask questions. He just stood, slipped on his cover, and walked straight out the front door. Across the quad, under the rising desert sun, the track was starting to come alive. Young soldiers, most of them barely out of high school, were warming up, stretching, laughing, still full of that restless, nervous energy that comes before the day's real work begins. A few glanced toward the admin building, where the earlier commotion had settled into something quieter but more tense. And off to the side, sitting alone on a concrete bench in the thin shade of a flagpole, was Kyona Ridge. Her duffel bag rested beside her feet. She hadn't left. She hadn't run. She just sat silent, alert, patient, watching the recruits as they moved, her eyes following the rhythm of their drills like she already knew what they were doing right and what they'd do wrong 2 minutes later. Boone crossed the open space without a word, his boots echoing faintly on the pavement. When he reached her, he stopped 6 feet away. She looked up. Their eyes met. There was no surprise in hers. No expectation either. Just recognition, the quiet kind that passes between soldiers who don't need introductions. Boone's voice was low, gravel and memory. That tattoo. Dusk Valley, April 2002. Kiona nodded once. Rear perimeter, she said. Took the south flank when the fallback failed. A gust of wind carried the scent of heat-baked sand and diesel from the motor pool. Boone took in a slow breath and exhaled through his nose. He reached up, adjusted his cover with one hand, then dropped it back to his side. My brother, he said. He was convoy security, Corporal Adam Boone. Her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted, like a photograph coming into focus. She tilted her head slightly. Lead vehicle? Boone nodded. Took the second blast full on. He said it was chaos. Fire, screaming, no air support. Everyone scrambled except for someone holding the southern rise. Said that's the only reason he made it through. Kiona looked away for a moment, out past the track where the recruits were now lining up for cadence. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before. Didn't know who was in the convoy. Didn't matter. Just knew they weren't out yet. Boone stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and in front of the entire formation, in full view of every soldier and staffer within sight of the field, he raised his hand in a formal salute. Not a nod, not a handshake. A full, regulation, perfect salute, crisp, deliberate, and held longer than required. Conversations stopped. A few cadences faltered midline. Heads turned. Even those who didn't know who she was understood in that moment that someone important had just been seen. Kiona didn't return the salute. She didn't need to. But she stood, slowly, and looked him in the eye. Boone dropped his hand and stepped close enough for only her to hear. You saved him, he said. She blinked. Once. Just once. The sun lit her face with stark shadows beneath the brim of her cap. Good, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's good. Boone nodded, then turned to face the formation. Young men and women now standing straighter than they had 5 minutes earlier. His voice was clear. Firm. If Sergeant Kiona Ridge wants to wear that shirt on my base, she wears it. If she wants to train, she trains. And if anyone has a problem with that... He turned his head just slightly, gaze falling toward the admin building's glass entry. They can come explain it to me, personally. No one moved. No one spoke. A moment later, Boone turned back to her. Walk with me, Sergeant. Let's make this right. And without another word, they walked side by side toward the front door, past the rows of stunned recruits, past the young lieutenants too proud to speak, and into a building that no longer felt like it could ignore her. The desert wind held its breath. It wasn't loud. This moment not a shout, not a marching command. But somehow, every sound on that base seemed to pause the instant Sheriff Silas Boone brought his hand up in salute. He stood straight and still, facing Kiona Ridge as if no one else existed. His right arm rose with measured precision, fingers aligned, palm angled perfectly. It was the kind of salute that hadn't been seen on that parade ground in years. Not because it wasn't practiced, but because it meant something this time. Across the track field, cadences faded. One by one, the young soldiers stopped mid-motion, their boots still, their arms frozen mid-swing. Even those who hadn't seen her face could feel the change in the air. Something old had just been uncovered, something they hadn't been taught in manuals. A few staff NCOs stood at the edge of the field, uncertain whether to step in or let it unfold. They stayed silent. Kiona didn't return the salute. She didn't move at all. Her posture remained upright, steady, the way it always had except for one subtle shift in her shoulders, like she'd finally allowed herself to be seen for what she was. Boone held the salute longer than regulation required. Maybe twice as long. When he finally dropped it, he turned not just to Kiona, but to the dozens of soldiers now watching from across the compound. His voice didn't rise, but it carried. If Kiona Ridge wants to wear that shirt, he said, pausing just enough to let the name settle. She wears it. Another pause. Deliberate. Not to wait for approval, but to give weight to what came next. If she wants to train with us, she trains. Boone's gaze swept across the field, then lifted slightly toward the admin building, where Lieutenant Bale now stood behind the glass doors, motionless. And if anyone has a problem with that, Boone continued, they can take it up with me, personally. Inside the admin office, Bale didn't move. His face had gone pale, the color drained from it like someone had flipped a breaker inside his chest. He stood there, watching, knowing full well that whatever authority he thought he had no longer held weight not in this moment. Out on the field, nobody spoke. A few recruits exchanged glances, eyes wide. Others simply stared. One of them, a private first class with a notched boot and a nervous twitch in his hands, whispered to the soldier beside him. "Who is she?" The other just shook his head. "Don't know, but I think we're supposed to." Kaona finally moved, not to speak, not to explain, but to stand beside Boone as he turned and began walking. She picked up her duffel with one fluid motion and followed him across the quad. And as they passed the formation, the recruits instinctively straightened, their postures sharpened. Some even nodded without realizing it. They didn't need an explanation. They could feel what had just shifted. A different kind of authority had entered the room, not by rank, but by presence. Back inside, as the doors closed behind them, the hum of the bass slowly returned. Cadences resumed, but they were quieter, slower. Like the whole place had inhaled something it didn't quite know how to process. And Lieutenant Bale, he stepped back from the window, the navy t-shirt he'd issued, still folded on the counter. It felt weightless in his hand now, meaningless. He didn't say a word, didn't offer an excuse. Somewhere deep in his gut, he knew this wasn't a mistake he could smooth over with paperwork. This was the kind of moment that stayed with you. And Kaona Ridge? She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't even glance his way. Because she hadn't come here to prove anything. She had come to show them what they'd forgotten. The door to Boone's office shut with a soft click. Inside, the cool air hummed and the blinds were drawn halfway, casting striped shadows across the desk where Major Elijah McGraw stood waiting. He held a sheet of paper in one hand, creased, official, dated 3 days earlier. His face was unreadable, but his eyes flicked to Boone with quiet exasperation. "It was in his inbox since Tuesday," McGraw said. Boone didn't answer. He just extended a hand, took the document, and sat down behind the desk. Kaona stood near the window, not speaking, not interrupting. She didn't need this part of the process. But she understood the value of it. Some things need to be written down, signed, filed, made real. Boone picked up a pen, read over the page in silence, then reached for a fresh form from the drawer. This one bore the Kyburn Gap command header. He began writing, each line slow and deliberate. No auto-filled boxes, no copied language. At the top, authorization for veteran participation, direct command discretion. Beneath that, status, permanent until revoked by commanding officer. He signed it, stamped it, dated it, then handed it across the desk to Kaona, without a word. She took it gently, folded it once with practiced precision, and slid it into her duffel. It wasn't a certificate. It wasn't an apology. But it was a restoration, quiet, complete, and issued with the only authority that still meant something. Boone looked to McGraw. "Get Bale." A minute later, the door opened, and Lieutenant Warren Bale stepped in, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. He stopped 3 paces from the desk and stood at attention, overcorrected, over-rehearsed. Boone didn't raise his voice. "You received this authorization days ago," he said, tapping the paper on the desk. "You ignored it. You questioned the legitimacy of someone cleared through chain of command. And worse, you judged her because her shirt was faded and she didn't ask for recognition." Bale's throat bobbed, but he didn't speak. Boone stood, slowly. He stepped around the desk, stopping just in front of the young officer, his voice quiet but cold enough to cut glass. "Next time you see someone standing straight without asking to be seen, think before you judge." The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. Bale gave a stiff nod, turned, and left the room without a word. When the door closed behind him, McGraw exhaled. "You handled that clean." Boone shook his head once. "Not clean, just right." He turned to Kiana, who hadn't moved. "Anything else you need?" She shook her head gently. "This is enough." For a second, none of them spoke. Then Boone added quietly, with the weight of memory behind his words, "You should have never needed to come back to be seen." Kiana didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I didn't come back to be seen." And that was the end of it. No medals, no speeches, just silence and the sound of something long overdue finally being corrected. The sun had climbed high by the time the recruits formed up on the track. The air shimmered above the asphalt, heat rising in quiet waves. Laughter had faded. The group of female trainees stood in staggered formation, adjusting their laces, rolling their shoulders, eyeing one another with that mix of tension and competitiveness common to every PT test in history. Kiana Ridge stepped into the group without ceremony. She didn't announce herself, didn't take the front. She stood off-center, quiet, eyes forward, body relaxed. Her faded PT shirt didn't match anyone else's. Her shorts were older, the color softened by time, but she moved with ease, like the ground already knew her. When the whistle blew, they began. At first, the younger ones surged ahead, legs quick, arms pumping too fast. Energy without pacing, ego without memory. But within the first lap, they started to falter. Kiana didn't. Her pace stayed steady, every stride measured, every breath controlled. She didn't chase anyone. She didn't slow for anyone. She became the standard without ever declaring it. One by one, the recruits fell into her rhythm, some behind her, some beside her, none ahead. Chief Nahuel, observing from the far end of the field, leaned against the fence with a clipboard under one arm. He'd been on bases long enough to know when a runner was holding back, when someone was there for more than reps and numbers. Beside him, Sheriff Boone stood silent, arms crossed. Nahuel didn't look away from the track when he spoke. "Sir," he said, "if she wanted to leave them behind, they'd never see her again." Boone said nothing. He didn't need to. By the third lap, sweat lined the brows of the youngest runners. Some gasped for breath. Others gritted their teeth. But Kiana's breathing hadn't changed. Her form was still perfect. Her eyes locked forward, unfazed. By the final lap, half the formation had dropped pace. A few slowed to a jog. One sat down entirely. Kiana never broke stride. And when the final whistle blew, she wasn't the fastest, not technically, but everyone on that field knew who had set the pace, who had pulled them forward, who had shown them what it looked like to endure, not because someone was watching, but because that's what endurance means. When she stepped off the track, she wasn't winded. She just walked over to the bleachers, picked up her duffel, and waited. No cheers, no medals, just quiet acknowledgement. A few recruits nodded as they passed her. One muttered, "Ma'am," under their breath. The legacy wasn't in the speed. It was in how she made them run better without saying a word. After the field cleared and the shouts and cadence calls faded into the distance, one trainee remained. She was barely 19, shoulders narrow, boots still too clean. A water bottle gripped tight in her hand like it might anchor her nerves. She stepped toward Kiana slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, were you really in Watch 37? My aunt used to tell me about them like they were ghosts." Kiana didn't flinch. She looked at the girl for a long second, sizing her up, not by uniform, but by the fear in her eyes, the hunger to understand something deeper. She didn't smile. She just answered honestly. "Not alone," she said, "but I was the one who got to walk out." The trainee blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the reply. Then she stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Why'd you come back? After everything? After what they took from you?" Kiana stood, brushed the dust off her knees with calm hands. She didn't rush the answer. Because someone needs to show you what quiet strength looks like, what it costs, and why it's worth it. She didn't explain more. She didn't need to. Kaona slung the duffel over her shoulder and made her way back to the jeep, the same one that had carried her in without recognition. Only this time, no one questioned her. The guards at the gate stood a little taller. The admin staff at the windows turned quietly back to their screens. Even Lieutenant Bale, watching from behind the blinds, said nothing. He didn't have to. She belonged now. And as she drove out toward the open desert, toward roads that didn't need names, Fort Kyburn shrank behind her in the mirror, smaller in size, but somehow more solid than it had been that morning. Not because of a salute, not because of a policy, but because they had finally seen her for who she really was. And the next time someone mentioned Unit 37, it wouldn't be a ghost story. It would be spoken in the silence of respect. Not all strength is loud. Some of the strongest people walk quietly, carry old scars, and never ask to be seen. Kaona Ridge didn't wear her past to prove anything. She wore it because it never left her. And when the world finally paused to look closer, it found honor where it had once seen only age. For those of us who've lived long enough to carry stories, this is our reminder. You don't need applause to matter. You've already earned your place, simply by standing firm, loving deeply, and staying true to who you are even when no one's watching. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you knew, or someone you were, subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor quiet strength, hidden service, and the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives. And before you go, tell us in the comments, who's someone in your life who taught you what quiet strength really looks like? Thanks for spending time with us. Until next time, stay steady, stay kind, and stay seen.